As a learning support teacher at the school, I've been responsible for doing the disability provisions for the HSC, and in this session I'm going to talk about some of the pros and cons of applying for provisions and some of the processes to help you clarify if you're thinking about it whether or not you should. So the definition of a disability is quite broad, as you can see here. The provisions itself, it's set up to help students that have communication issues like reading difficulties, to support access if they need reading support, maybe braille. The condition can be permanent or it can be temporary, and we have got a process set up as well for emergency provisions. It's really important to note and stop here if you're thinking about applying because you are ESL or you're not prepared for a subject or you think it's going to give you an advantage, or something that can be rectified. So for example, if you have a vision issue that can be rectified with glasses, you wear the glasses and it's rectified. So hopefully that clarifies a little bit here some of the things that you can and cannot apply for. So everyone's different and disabilities are all very unique. So it is judged on a case-by-case scenario with NESA. And there could be a range of learning difficulties or medical difficulties, so from learning, medical, vision to hearing difficulties. And some of the provisions that can get granted are, for example, braille, use of a writer, so you get the scribe or reader, an oral interpreter, for example, for hearing impairment. You can get extension time for the exam. You can get rest breaks. That's really helpful, so particularly for students with anxiety. You can get a hot pack, separate exam supervision. Now, most of these provisions I've got listed here are board endorsed. There's a couple here, like the hot pack, that are school endorsed. So I've had a student with a shoulder injury and the principal could grant her the provision of the hot pack during all her exams. If you're thinking of applying, here's a few scenarios to help tick it one way or the other for you. So for some students with special provisions, they've had these provisions all their life, so from primary to high school. Maybe they've had a reader for a reading difficulty all the way through, so you should apply. This is really, to help support you access the practical part of the exam. So yes, apply if you had a pre-existing and a lifelong condition. With some students with learning difficulties, it really does vary the level of difficulty and the access to the material. So it needs to be on case by case there. Depends on how it presents in an exam. And schools can do assessments, or you can get your specialists, other practitioners to do assessments to help support that and give an idea of what sort of provisions might be needed and what the difficulty is for the student exactly, because it does vary. There's a whole spectrum of difficulties there. If an emergency situation were to happen, you should definitely apply and apply immediately, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. If you're finding the subjects are just too difficult, or you're not connecting with the teacher, no, this is not about that. Stress is a really difficult one to judge. You're the best judge of that. It depends on whether you're using the stress positively or negatively, if you're getting support for it, and if it's likely to improve. So these are a few guidelines to get you started. Now, on the exam day, if something were to unfortunately happen, there is a special process set up called the misadventure process, and this process is dealt with by principals and the presiding officer at the school, and it needs to be dealt with immediately on the day. So for example, migraines, which can be intermittent, if you get a migraine on the day, it's best to come in and sit the exam and do the paperwork for the misadventure and put in the reasons and any supporting evidence for that. If there were an accident or something else that permits you from being here on the day, unfortunately, contact the school immediately or get someone to contact the school so we're notified, and the paperwork is done immediately. It's very important to move quickly with misadventure process. There is time deadlines with this. Okay, some of the dates you need to note. If you've got a pre-existing learning or medical difficulty you want to apply for provisions, the applications open up in year 11, so you can apply from term 3, the year before your HSC, but they do close for pre-existing conditions at the end of term 1, the year of your HSC exam. Now for other changing conditions, there's always application can be made at a later date. So see your teachers, see your principal, see the learning support teacher and discuss the conditions, especially if something's getting worse, and definitely if there's an emergency conditional application, there's a misadventure process for that. There's excellent scenarios on the website that you can see here of case studies that have been done and the types of provisions that have been granted and ones that have been diagnosed and declared and approved. In this scenario, so a student has dyslexia, they've requested a rider and extra time, and they've got the diagnostic evidence. They've got an educational psychologist report, speech pathology report. This is optional. We're not saying you need to do this for every student with dyslexia or reading difficulty. This is just to give you an idea of the process and the evidence is presented. So the functional evidence is provided by schools, and schools are responsible for doing the disability provision applications. So they will get the evidence, they will run the test for dyslexia or learning difficulties, and they'll need to collect that evidence. And then in this case study here, they've got approved for a rider and small group supervision. But because they got the rider, the extra time to write was declined, and that was based on the sample essays the students provided. It was outside the guidelines. So there's a whole range of scenarios that are really helpful to give you an idea of the provisions you can and cannot apply for. Here's another one for anxiety and depression. So with this one, they wanted small group, extra time and rest breaks. They provided psychologist doctor report, and the teachers and the school did their evidence about how the student was using the rest break at school. They got approved in this scenario for a writer and small group supervision, but the extra time to write was declined as there's no evidence to support this. This provision is really, as I said, they're a practical arrangement, the disability provisions. So it's more like if you have a hand impairment or specific things that stops you accessing the exams, like with the writing skills. And if it can be overcome with a writer, so you won't need the extra time in this scenario. It's a really good idea to have a look at the website and get more of the case studies. Okay, well, thank you for listening to the disability provisions overview for the HSC. Now, it is the disability provisions is always changing. It did used to be called special provisions, and now NESA is the body that approves and declines the applications. Schools are responsible for doing the applications. So if you have got queries about whether or not you're going to apply, what sort of evidence you need, when you should apply, act sooner. It's a really good idea in Year 10, Year 11 to have these discussions so you can set up and practice using those provisions if they're needed. And there's a lot of people in the school there to support you. Thank you. Bye.